Lots, Sammy said. Piles, boss. Show me. They fetched the portfolio and tried to explain what it was they intended to do. Adults. Annabelle said after a few minutes of listening, you're talking about getting adults to read comic books. The cousins looked at each other. They had not quite expressed or understood it that way before. I guess so, Sammy said. Yes, said Joe. Adults with adult money. Annabelle nodded, stroking his chin. Sammy could see a relief flowing into his shoulders and the hinges of his jaw, nodding them, sending Annabelle tilting back in his big leather swivel chair with a grandeur and an ease not entirely free of the threat of metal fatigue and failing springs. Whether it was relief at having at last found a worthy basis for his commerce, or merely that he was comforted by the reassuring proximity of certain failure, Sammy could not be sure. Okay, Annabelle said. Reaching for his unfinished letter, we'll give it a try. Get to work. Joe started to walk away, but Sammy took hold of his arm and pulled him back. They stood. Annabelle added another sentence to his letter, considered it, then looked up. Yes? What about this not enormous money from Parnassus? Sammy said. We've got a piece of the radio show. You gave us a piece of the newspaper strip. I don't see why we... Oh, for God's sake, Annabelle said. Don't even bother to finish, Mr. Clay. I've heard it all before. Sammy grinned. And? Annabelle's smile grew cagey and very, very small. I'm not averse. I can't speak for Jack, but I'll take it up with him and see if we can't work something out. All right, Sammy said, surprised and a little suspicious and sensing an imminent condition. Now, Annabelle said, see if you can guess what I'm about to say to you. They're putting Zimanowski on a bubblegum card. Maybe you aren't aware of this, Annabelle said, but Parnassus Pictures does a very healthy business in Europe. I didn't know that. Yes. As a matter of fact, their second biggest market after the domestic is, of all places, Germany, said Joe. Naturally. They're a little concerned about the reputation you two have earned for this company in your many imaginative ways as an antagonistic to the citizens and government of that nation of fanatical moviegoers. I had a long talk with Mr. Frank Singe, the studio head. He made it very clear. Don't even bother to finish, Sammy said. He was disgusted. We've heard it all before. He looked appealingly at Joe, willing him to speak up, to tell Annabelle about his family and the indignities to which they were being exposed, the 100 cruelties, gross and tiny, to which, with an almost medical regimentation, they were being subjected by the Reichsprotektorat. He was sure that Annabelle would give in once again. All right, Joe said softly. I will stop the fighting. Annabelle's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Joe, Sammy said. He was shocked. Joe, come on. What are you talking about? You can't give up. This is censorship. We're being censored. This is the very thing we're supposed to be standing up to. The escapist would stand up to something like this. The escapist is not a real person. Yeah, I know that. Christ. Sam, said Joe, his cheeks reddening. He put a hand on Sammy's arm. I appreciate what you think you are doing, but I want to do this now. He tapped the portfolio. I'm tired of fighting. Maybe for a little while. I fight, and I am fighting some more, and it just makes me have less hope, not more. I need to do something that will be great, instead of trying always to be good. Joe, Sammy started to argue, but just as quickly gave up. Fine. He said, we'll lay off the Nazis. It won't be long anyway till we're in this war. And then I promise to give you the satisfaction of reminding me of my ignoble behavior here this morning, said Annabelle, as well as a share, something very modest, I assure you, in the small bounty that Hollywood is going to provide us with. The cousins started away. Sammy looked back. What about the Japs, he said. The sudden small efflorescence of art, minor but genuine, in the tawdry product line of what was then the fifth or sixth largest comic book company in America, has usually been attributed to the potent spell of Citizen Kane acting on the renascent aspirations of Joe Cavalier. But without the thematic ban imposed by Sheldon Anipal at the behest of Parnassus Pictures, the censorship of all storylines having to do with Nazis, Japs too, warfare, saboteurs, fifth columnists, and so on, which forced Sammy and Joe to a drastic reconsideration of the raw materials of their stories, the magical run of issues that commenced with Radio Comics number 19, and finished when Pearl Harbor caught up to the 2-month Empire lead time in the 21st issue of Triumph Comics, February 1942. Looks pretty unlikely. In 8 issues apiece of Radio, Triumph, All Doll, and the now monthly escapist adventures, the emphasis is laid, for the first time, not only on the superpowered characters, normally so enveloped in their inevitable shrouds of bullets, torpedoes, poison gases, hurricane winds, evil spells, and so forth, that the lineaments of their personalities, if not of their deltoids and quadriceps, could hardly be discerned, but also almost radically for the comic book of the time, on the ordinary people around them, whose own exploits by the time hostilities with Germany were formally engaged in the early months of 1942, had advanced so far into the foreground of each story that such emphasis itself on the everyday heroics of the powerless may be seen to constitute, at least in hindsight, kind of secret and hence probably ineffectual propaganda. There were stories that dealt with the minutiae of what Mr. Machine Gun, at home in the pages of Triumph, liked to call the hero biz, told not only from the point of view of the heroes, but from those of various butlers, girlfriends, assistants, shoeshine boys, doctors, and even the criminals. There was a story that followed the course of a handgun through the mean streets of Empire City, in which the escapist appeared on only 2 pages. Another celebrated story told the tale of Luna Moth's girlhood and filled in gaps in her biography through a complicated series of flashbacks narrated by a group of unemployed witches, familiars, talking rats and cats and reptilian whatsits in a dark little hangout outside of Phantomville. And there was Kane Street focusing for 64 pages on one little street in Empire City as its denizens hearing the terrible news that the escapist lies near death in the hospital. Recall in turn the way he has touched their lives and the lives of everyone in town, only to have it all turn out in the end as a cruel hoax perpetrated by the evil, crooked man. All of those forays into chopping up the elements of narrative and mixing and isolating odd points of view and stretching as far as was possible in those days under the constraints of a jaded editor and of publishers who cared chiefly for the stale, safe profit, the limits of comic book storytelling. All these exercises were, without question, raised far beyond the level of mere exercise by the unleashed inventiveness of Joe Cavalier's pencil. Joe, too, made a survey of the tools at hand and found them more useful and interesting than he ever had before. But the daring use of perspective and shading, the radical placement of word balloons and captions, and above all, the integration of narrative and picture by means of artfully disarranged, dislocated panels that stretched, shrank, opened into circles, spread across 2 full pages, marched diagonally toward the one corner of a page, unreeled themselves like the frames of a film. All these were made possible only by the full collaboration of writer and artist together. Whether the delightful fruit of his collaboration came at a price, whether the 32 extra issues, the 2,000 extra pages of Nazi smashing obviated by Anipal's ban might somehow, incrementally, have slid across into the war sooner, whether the advantage gained in time would have precipitated an earlier victory, whether that victory, coming a day or a week or a month earlier, would have sufficed to preserve a dozen or 100 or 1,000 more lives. Such questions now can have only an academic poignancy, as both the ghosts and those haunted by them are dead. At any rate, the circulation figures for the Cavalier and Clay titles increased steadily until, by the abrupt termination of the partnership, they had nearly doubled. Though whether this amazing growth was due to the book's marked advance in sophistication and quality, or was simply a product of the general explosion in comic book sales that occurred in the months leading up to the entry of America into the war, is difficult to assess. Great ringing blizzards blowing in from Hollywood, from radio, from Milton Bradley and Mark's Toys, Hostess Cakes, and inevitably the Yale Law Company, but most of all from the change purses, dungaree pockets, and genuine latex rubber escapist coin banks of the nation, blanketed the offices on the 25th floor of the Empire State Building. It required shovels and snowplows and crews of men working around the clock to keep up ahead of the staggering avalanche of money. Some of this snowfall ended up, in due course, in the bank account of Joseph Cavalier, where it towered in fantastic drifts. It was left that way, aloof and glinting, to cool the fever of exile from the day his family should arrive.